Subscribe to Echo Tales for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. Ella had gotten used to her own company, not out of choice, but out of quiet surrender. Her days were filled with soft routines, morning coffee brewed for one, walks with headphones as the city hummed around her, and evenings wrapped in a blanket, watching movies that ended in kisses she never got to. Feel. She was kind, composed, and always the friend people turned to, but rarely the one they stayed for. Romance had slipped through her fingers too many times. Once in college when he chose someone else, once after a long-distance promise that faded into silence, and then slowly, over time, through moments that never quite became anything. Love didn't knock anymore. It sent postcards from faraway places and kept its distance. And so, she lived quietly, telling herself it was enough. That she was enough. Until one rainy Wednesday evening, her phone buzzed with a message that felt oddly warm against the cold glow of her apartment lights. It was from Lena, her closest friend from university, the kind of friend who remembered the little things, like how Ella liked her tea, or what song made her cry in secret. Dinner at ours this Friday? Just us. Been too long. Come? It was a simple invitation, but Ella stared at it longer than she should have. Memories came rushing back, wine-stained laughter, shared secrets under starlit skies, and the way Lena's husband, Mark, had always made Ella feel safe. He was the kind of man who held the door without thinking, who listened with his whole presence, whose smile lingered like an afterthought you didn't want to forget. There had been a time long ago when Ella thought maybe, just maybe, Mark could have been her person. But life had other plans. He fell in love with Lena, and Ella had tucked her feelings into the quiet corners of friendship, never to be spoken aloud. Now, years later, they were inviting her back into their world. Something about that night felt different. Not just a friendly dinner. Something unspoken lingered in the space between words. She hesitated only for a second before typing back, "I'd love to." Friday arrived faster than she expected. She wore her softest sweater, dabbed on a hint of perfume she hadn't touched in months, and told herself it was just dinner. But when she stepped into their cozy, candlelit home, it didn't feel like just dinner. It felt like being remembered. Lena's arms wrapped around her in that familiar embrace, and Mark's eyes held hers for a beat longer than she was ready. 4. The smell of roasted herbs and old wine filled the air, but it was the warmth between the three of them that truly fed something inside Ella she hadn't felt in years. They talked, they laughed, they fell into old rhythms like nothing had changed. But things had changed. Ella felt it in the way Mark's gaze would flicker toward her when Lena wasn't looking. She saw it in how Lena would study Ella when she thought she wasn't being noticed. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was gentle, curious, full of something tender that made her heart beat a little faster. When the night stretched into soft music and glowing firelight, and the world outside seemed to hush, Ella realized something. She wasn't just a guest. She was wanted. Not out of pity or friendship, but something deeper. She didn't know what the night would bring. But part of her, the part that still believed in love no matter how quiet it had grown, leaned in. And in that moment, sitting between two people she thought she had lost to time, Ella's heart whispered something she hadn't heard in a long time. This could be the beginning of something. From the moment Ella stepped into the living room, something about the atmosphere felt softer. The lights were dimmed low, music hummed quietly through vintage speakers, and the warmth in the air wasn't just from the fire crackling in the hearth. It was from the way Lena smiled at her, and the way Mark looked at her like he hadn't in years. There was an intimacy in the room that didn't need to be spoken. It lingered in the pauses between laughter and in the way their fingers brushed too often to be accidental. Dinner had been delicious, but it was the after that stayed with her. The red wine staining the edges of her glass, the velvet of the couch beneath her legs, the closeness of their bodies as they shared old stories and new confessions. Ella felt like she had slipped into a different version of her life, one where she was not on the outside looking in, but inside something quietly unfolding. Mark, with his deep voice and thoughtful silences, leaned toward her more than usual, his eyes lingering on her lips when she spoke. Lena sat beside her, their knees touching, her smile dreamy and warm, as if Ella's presence was a gift she'd waited to unwrap. The more they talked, the more Ella felt her walls crumble, slowly, tenderly, like paper soaked in rain. When, Lena laughed, she touched Ella's hand and didn't pull away. When Mark spoke, his words seemed aimed at Ella's heart, rather than just her ears. It wasn't flirtation. It was deeper than that. It was attention. Gentle, soulful attention that made Ella feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. She tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself it was the wine, the nostalgia, the lighting. But when Lena turned to her, voice low and eyes full of something that shimmered between affection and longing, Ella knew she wasn't imagining it. "You've always been strong, Ella," Lena said softly, her fingers grazing Ella's. "But even strong hearts need someone to hold them." Ella blinked, surprised by the words, by the sudden pressure in her chest that felt like it might break open. Mark's voice followed, deep and sincere. "You give so much of yourself, but who gives to you?" The silence after was heavy with emotion. Ella's lips parted, but no words came. Her throat was tight, her heart thundering in, her ears. She looked between them, at Lena's gentle eyes, at Mark's steady gaze, and she saw it. The offer. The question neither of them had spoken aloud. Not pity, not desire exactly, but a kind of love that felt inclusive, embracing, warm. A quiet, understanding passed between the three of them, held in the space between heartbeats. The music played on, something old and romantic, and Ella felt like time had folded in on itself. Like they were all standing at the edge of something delicate and beautiful and impossibly complicated. Her mind wanted to retreat, wanted to protect itself from hope. But her heart, her heart was leaning in, aching for more. Lena squeezed her hand gently. "You're not alone tonight, not if you don't want to be." Ella's eyes stung with unshed tears, not because she was sad, but because she suddenly realized how lonely she had been, and how, somehow, in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected people, she felt less alone than she had in years. That night, something unspoken passed between them like a spark in the dark. Not a decision. Not yet. But a moment. One Ella would carry with her long after the candles had burned down and the wine had run dry. A moment that whispered, "What if love isn't always the way you expect it? What if it's better?" The night had fallen quiet, but Ella's heart had not. After Lena and Mark had said goodnight and disappeared into their bedroom, Ella was left alone in the guest room, curled beneath a blanket that still carried the scent of lavender and wood smoke. But no matter how she turned on the soft bed, sleep wouldn't come. The wine had worn off, but the warmth hadn't. It lingered inside her, not the warmth of alcohol, but of something deeper, heavier, and far more complicated. Thoughts spun like delicate thread in her mind. She replayed every glance from Mark, every gentle word from Lena, and the way their bodies leaned into hers, not out of habit, but out of want. It stirred something in her chest she hadn't felt in a long time. Desire, not just of the physical kind, but of belonging, of being chosen. There had always been a flicker between her and Mark, even back in college before he and Lena had become the golden couple. A spark they never dared name, but now, years later, there was something else, something shared. It was as if Lena had known all along, and maybe she had. That thought both comforted and terrified Ella. The rain began to fall gently outside, tapping against the window pane like a lullaby that wouldn't settle. With a sigh and a restless heart, she got up and stepped onto the small balcony, pulling a shawl over her shoulders. The cool air kissed her cheeks, and the city lights blurred in the misty distance. And then, quietly, footsteps behind her. She turned, half expecting, half hoping, and there stood Lena, wrapped in a shawl of her own, eyes soft in the low light. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked gently. Ella shook her head, her voice caught in her throat. "Too much on my mind." Lena nodded and moved beside her, the two of them standing in the hush of the rain, closer than before. "Do you ever wonder," Lena said quietly, "what might have happened if life went a little differently?" The question wrapped around Ella like a ribbon, pulling tight on memories she thought she'd let go of. She turned to Lena slowly. "All the time." Lena looked at her, really looked, and in that moment, the space between them vanished. There was no jealousy in her gaze, no hesitation, only something tender and real. Ella didn't know how to explain the feeling, being wanted, not just by one person, but welcomed by two. Not in a way that felt reckless, but in a way that felt whole. Behind them, a soft sound of the balcony door opening again. Mark stepped out, his expression unreadable but kind, his presence grounding. He joined them without words, and in the silence that followed, something unspoken settled between the three of them. Ella's heart ached, not with pain, but with the overwhelming realization that love didn't have to be a triangle, or a line, or a box. It could be something else entirely, something fluid, open, deeply honest. "We care about you, Ella," Mark said finally, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to keep carrying everything alone." Ella looked at him, then at Lena, their faces illuminated by soft rainlight, and something more. She wanted to speak, but found no words, only tears quietly falling, released not from sadness, but from long-buried longing finally being seen. The three of them stood there as the rain kept falling, not touching yet, connected by something stronger than words, something real. And in that moment, Ella knew this night was a turning point. What came next might be uncertain, but the feeling in her chest, that was undeniable. It was love, reborn in the most unexpected way. Morning arrived like a soft breath after a long-held silence, and Ella sat alone at the edge of the kitchen table, her coffee untouched, cooling in its delicate porcelain cup. The world outside was still wrapped in fog, and the light filtering through the windows was gentle, golden, almost shy. Yet inside her chest, emotions moved like a storm, quiet but powerful, impossible to ignore. She heard light footsteps, and then Lena appeared, her hair still tousled from sleep, eyes calm but searching. Behind her, Mark followed, equally quiet, like the morning itself. They joined her at the table, one sitting on either side, not imposing, not assuming, but present, real. For a moment, none of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was thick with meaning, with choices unspoken but deeply felt. Ella's fingers curled around the edge of her coffee cup as if trying to steady herself. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, not as a blur, but in vivid, lingering detail. The rain, the shared words, the looks that said, "We see you. We want you here. You matter to us." Finally, Mark spoke, his voice low, the kind of voice you remember not just in your ears, but in your chest. "We know this might feel unusual, but sometimes love doesn't fit the usual story. He looked at her with a gaze so open, so free of pressure, that it made Ella want to cry. Lena nodded, her voice wrapping gently around the moment like a blanket. We've spent a long time building something strong, something honest. And somewhere in that, we started to feel more. For you. Ella's breath hitched. Her heart felt too big for her body. This wasn't a game. This wasn't about loneliness or excitement. It was something far more sacred. But what does it mean? She whispered, more to herself than to them. How can I be sure I'm not intruding? Mark reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, steady and warm. You're not breaking anything, Ella. You're adding to something that already had space for you. And then Lena, her voice softer still. You've always had a place in our lives. Maybe we're just finally ready to say it aloud. Tears welled in Ella's eyes, and she let them fall this time. Not out of confusion, but release. She had spent so many years convincing herself that she was too much or not enough, that love would come one day, wrapped neatly in a traditional package, and anything else was settling. But here it was, right in front of her. Love that was gentle, layered, patient. Love that chose her, not out of guilt or pity, but because she made the whole thing feel more complete. She looked at both of them, the people she had trusted for years, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something different, something beautiful. What do we do now? She asked, her voice cracking with emotion. Lena smiled, tears in her eyes too. We figure it out, together, slowly, with care. Ella nodded, feeling a new kind of peace settle over her. It wasn't about labels or definitions. It was about connection, safety, desire, and the deep human need to be held without question. In the warmth of that kitchen, with rain still pattering gently outside and hearts laid bare on the table, Ella felt something she hadn't in years, chosen. And maybe love didn't look the way she once imagined it, but as she let herself lean into their embrace, laughter and tears mixing in a perfect, imperfect moment, she finally understood. Sometimes what the heart needs is not what it expects, but what it has always quietly hoped for.